The harsh Montana winter of 2023 brought unexpected challenges to John Weaver's quiet life. At 62 years old, the retired forest ranger had seen his fair share of severe weather, but something about this particular morning felt different. The sun hadn't yet risen over the snow-covered peaks surrounding his remote cabin, and the wind howled with an unusual intensity that made even his sturdy home creak and groan. John had always been an early riser, a habit formed during his 3 decades of service in the forestry department. On this morning, he sat at his worn kitchen table, warming his weathered hands around a steaming cup of black coffee. The temperature reading on his outdoor thermometer showed an alarming -30 degrees Fahrenheit, and the weather forecast on his old radio warned of worse conditions to come. Through his frost-covered kitchen window, John could barely make out the shapes of his storage shed and garage, both nearly buried under the heavy snowfall from the previous night. The trees surrounding his property swayed dangerously in the wind, their branches heavy with ice and snow. This was the kind of weather that made him grateful for his well-stocked pantry and the cord of firewood he carefully stored away during the warmer months. As he sipped his coffee, John's mind wandered to the wildlife in the area. He'd spent years observing and protecting the local animals, and he knew how challenging these extreme conditions could be for them. Bears should have been in hibernation by now, the deer would be seeking shelter in the lower valleys, and smaller creatures would be huddled in their dens, waiting for the storm to pass. The isolation of his cabin had never bothered John before. After his wife Sarah passed away 5 years ago, he found peace in the solitude of the mountains. Their children, now grown with families of their own in Seattle and Portland, called regularly but visited rarely due to the remote location. John had adapted to living alone, finding company in the wildlife that frequented his property and the occasional visits from his old ranger colleagues. Rising from his chair, John pulled on his heavy winter coat, thick wool socks, and insulated boots. Despite the brutal weather, he knew he needed to check his property for any damage from the storm. Years of experience had taught him that small problems could quickly become major issues if left unattended, especially in weather like this. Before heading out, he gathered his essential gear, a powerful flashlight, his trusty multi-tool, and the emergency radio he always carried. Even though his cabin was only 100 yards from the storage shed and garage, the weather conditions made even this short distance potentially treacherous. The moment John opened his front door, the bitter cold hit him like a physical force. The wind whipped snow into his face, and his breath immediately formed ice crystals in his beard. He pulled his scarf tighter around his face and carefully made his way down the cleared path he'd made the night before, though it was now covered with fresh snow. As he trudged through the knee-deep snow, John's trained eyes scanned his surroundings. The storage shed's roof seemed to be holding up well under the weight of the snow, and the solar panels on his cabin roof were still visible enough to function once the sun came up. These observations gave him some relief, but he knew he needed to check everything thoroughly. Approaching the storage shed, something caught his attention. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on his ears, but as he got closer, he could clearly hear scratching sounds coming from inside. John paused, his years of experience making him cautious. Wildlife seeking shelter wasn't uncommon during severe weather, but any animal desperate enough to approach human structures could be dangerous. Moving carefully, John made his way to the shed's frozen window. He wiped away the frost with his gloved hand and peered inside, using his flashlight to illuminate the dark interior. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. There, huddled in the corner among his stored equipment, was a large black bear with 2 small cubs, all 3 of them shivering visibly in the cold. In that moment, John Weaver knew his morning was about to become far more complicated than he'd anticipated. His mind raced with possibilities as he stood there in the howling wind, watching the desperate family that had sought refuge in his shed. Little did he know, the decision he would make in the next few minutes would become a story that would amaze everyone who heard it. John's discovery of the bear family in his storage shed sent his mind racing through years of ranger training. The mother bear, clearly exhausted, had positioned herself protectively around her cubs. Her dark fur was dusted with snow, suggesting they had been traveling through the storm before finding shelter. The cubs, probably no more than a few months old, pressed against their mother's body for warmth. Through the frosted window, John observed the bear's behavior carefully. In his 30 years as a forest ranger, he had encountered countless black bears, but this situation was different. These bears should have been deep in hibernation by now. Their presence here, in his shed, during one of the worst storms of the season, meant something had forced them from their winter den. The scratching sound he'd heard earlier came from one of the cubs pawing at an old tarp, trying to pull it closer for warmth. The mother bear's eyes, alert despite her obvious exhaustion, followed John's movements outside the window. There was something in her gaze that struck him, not the usual wild fear or aggression he was accustomed to seeing, but a deep wariness and what seemed almost like desperation. Inside the shed, his tools and equipment were scattered where the bears had pushed things aside to make their temporary nest. An old wooden workbench had been knocked over, and various garden implements lay strewn across the floor. But property damage was the least of John's concerns right now. The temperature was still dropping, and the wind had picked up even more force. Drawing from his experience, John knew that black bears rarely attacked humans unless they felt threatened or were protecting their young. However, these were extreme circumstances. The mother bear was clearly stressed, and stressed animals were unpredictable. The fact that she hadn't immediately charged at his presence at the window was remarkable. As John stood there, snowflakes collecting on his shoulders, he noticed more details about the bear family's condition. The mother's breathing seemed labored, and her fur appeared matted in places. The cubs, while alert, showed signs of exhaustion too. One of them had a slight limp, suggesting they had traveled far to reach this point. The situation presented a serious dilemma. The storage shed, while providing some shelter from the wind, was not insulated. The metal walls did little to protect against the extreme cold, and the gaps under the door allowed bitter draughts to sweep through. John could see his own breath inside the shed when he shined his flashlight through the window, indicating just how cold it was in there. He stepped back from the window, his boots crunching in the fresh snow as he considered his options. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to leave them alone and let nature take its course. That's what his training would suggest, but something about this situation felt different. These bears hadn't just wandered into his shed by chance. They were fighting for survival. John thought about his heated garage, just 30 yards away. It was spacious, secure, and most importantly, warm. He had used it before to store equipment and even to shelter injured wildlife temporarily during his ranger days. The garage had a side door that could be left open, giving the bears an escape route if they needed it. As these thoughts ran through his mind, the wind grew even stronger, howling through the trees and sending snow swirling around him in white sheets. The temperature on his pocket thermometer had dropped another 5 degrees. His years of experience told him that without intervention, the bears might not survive until morning in the unheated shed. Looking back through the window one last time, John saw one of the cubs trying to nurse from its mother. The sight tugged at his heart. He remembered all the times during his ranger career when he'd had to maintain his distance from wildlife in distress, following the protocol of non-intervention. This time felt different. This wasn't about following rules. It was about making a moral choice. Standing there in the brutal cold, John Weaver began to formulate a plan. It would be risky, perhaps one of the most dangerous things he'd ever attempted. But as he watched the bear family huddled together in his shed, he knew he couldn't simply walk away. The decision he was about to make would require all of his experience, courage, and understanding of wildlife behavior, and even then, there were no guarantees of success. Back inside his cabin, John paced the wooden floor as he wrestled with his decision. The old wall clock ticked loudly, marking each precious moment that passed while the bears remained in the freezing shed. His years of training echoed in his mind, reminding him of all the reasons he shouldn't interfere with wildlife, especially a mother bear with cubs. He pulled out his worn notebook, the same one he'd used during his ranger days, and began writing down his observations. The mother bear's behavior was unusual. She showed no signs of aggression when he appeared at the window. The cubs appeared to be from last spring, making them about 8 or 9 months old. They should have been denning by now, which meant something must have disturbed their winter shelter. John picked up his phone and dialed Mark Thompson, a former colleague who was still active in the Forestry Service. After 3 rings, Mark's familiar voice answered. John explained the situation quickly, his voice tense with concern. Mark listened carefully before sighing heavily. "John, you know the protocol," Mark said. "We can't officially recommend interfering with wildlife, especially bears. But," he paused, "you're not a ranger anymore, and I know you'll do what you think is right. Just be careful, old friend." The conversation ended, leaving John exactly where he started, alone with a difficult decision. He walked to his window and looked out at the shed. The storm had intensified, and the wind chill had pushed the temperature down to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Even the hardiest animals would struggle to survive in these conditions. Moving to his bookshelf, John pulled out his old wildlife management manuals. He spent the next hour reviewing everything he knew about black bears, their behavior, their survival instincts, and most importantly, their interactions with humans. The more he read, the more he became convinced that this situation was unique. Sarah would have known what to do, he thought, remembering his late wife. She had always been the one to push him toward compassion when his training called for distance. He could almost hear her voice now, telling him that sometimes rules needed to be bent when lives were at stake. John began making preparations, knowing that if he was going to help these bears, he needed a solid plan. He drew a rough map of his property, marking the shortest path from the shed to the garage. Then he listed all the potential risks and solutions he could think of. The mother bear could charge. He would need to maintain a safe distance and ensure clear escape routes. The cubs might scatter. He would need to create a clear path for them to follow. The bears might refuse to move. He would need to make the garage more appealing than the shed. The garage needed to be prepared. He would need to secure any dangerous items and create a comfortable space. Standing at his kitchen counter, John prepared several pounds of thawed fish from his freezer. During his ranger days, he learned that food could be a powerful motivator for wildlife, though he knew offering it directly would be risky. Instead, he planned to use it to create a scent trail. He put on his warmest gear, thermal underwear, wool pants, his heaviest coat, and insulated boots. In his pockets, he placed his radio, a flashlight, and bear spray, not that he wanted to use it, but safety had to come first. He also grabbed several thick blankets from his linen closet. Before heading out, John stood before the photograph of Sarah on the mantel. "Well, honey," he whispered, "I'm either about to do something incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Maybe both." You could almost see her smile of approval. The internal struggle between his training and his conscience was reaching its peak. Everything he'd learned in his career told him to leave the bears alone, but everything he believed about compassion and responsibility urged him to act. The lives of 3 magnificent creatures hung in the balance, and time was running out. As John reached for his door handle, he knew that once he stepped outside, there would be no turning back. His decision would either become one of the most remarkable stories of human-wildlife interaction, or it could end in disaster. The next few hours would test everything he knew about bears, nature, and himself. With a deep breath, John opened his door and stepped out into the howling storm, ready to attempt something that went against every protocol he ever learned as a ranger. The bitter wind whipped around John as he made his way to the garage first. His breath formed icy clouds in the beam of his flashlight as he unlocked the large door. The garage was significantly warmer than outside, thanks to the small heater he kept running to protect his tools from rust. This would be perfect for the bears. Warm enough to survive the night, but not so warm that it would shock their systems. Working quickly and methodically, John cleared a large space in the corner of the garage. He laid down several thick blankets, creating a makeshift den area. He moved his tools and equipment to the opposite side, securing anything that could be dangerous. The small side door would serve as an escape route, giving the bears a way out when they were ready to leave. Next came the most crucial part of his plan. John took the thawed fish and carefully created a scent trail from the shed to the garage. He didn't place the fish directly on the ground, but rather dragged them through the snow, leaving an invisible but detectable path that he hoped the bears would follow. The last few pieces he placed just inside the garage's main door. Standing in the garage doorway, John surveyed his work. The space was ready, warm, secure, and inviting for the bear family. Now came the most dangerous part, getting them to move from the shed to the garage. He knew that the next few minutes would be critical. One wrong move could spell disaster. John pulled out his radio and spoke quietly into it. "This is John Weaver. If anyone's monitoring this channel, I'm attempting a wildlife rescue at my property. Just in case." He left the message hanging, hoping he wouldn't need any emergency assistance. Approaching the storage shed, John could still hear movement inside. The scratching had stopped, but occasional soft grunts told him the bears were still awake. He positioned himself carefully, making sure he had a clear path to safety if things went wrong. With trembling hands that had nothing to do with the cold, John reached for the shed's door handle. He had decided that opening it just a few inches would be enough. The bears would detect the scent trail, and hopefully, their instincts would guide them toward the warmer shelter. The metal door creaked slightly as John eased it open. He could feel the mother bear's presence on the other side, her energy filling the small space. The sound of the cub's movement became more distinct. John stepped back slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. Through the narrow opening, he could see the mother bear raise her head, her nostrils flaring as she caught the scent of the fish. Her dark eyes focused on the gap in the door, alert but not aggressive. The cubs stirred beside her, their small bodies pressing against her fur. John retreated further, maintaining what he hoped was a safe distance. The wind had died down slightly, which he took as a good sign. The bears would be able to follow the scent trail more easily. He positioned himself behind his truck, where he could observe without being too obvious. Minutes passed like hours as John waited. The temperature continued to drop, and he stamped his feet quietly to keep warm. Just when he was beginning to think his plan had failed, he saw movement at the shed door. The mother bear's massive head appeared in the opening. She emerged slowly, cautiously, her powerful body tense as she surveyed the area. Her cubs remained in the shed, making soft whimpering sounds. John held his breath, knowing these next moments were crucial. The bear's nose led her to the scent trail. She followed it a few steps, then returned to the shed. To John's amazement, she seemed to be investigating the path, checking if it was safe for her cubs. This was exactly what he had hoped for. She was smart enough to understand that this might be a way to better shelter. As he watched from his hidden position, John realized that his decision had brought him to a point of no return. The mother bear was now fully aware of the path he had created, and what happened next would depend entirely on her. His years of experience told him to stay still and patient, but his heart raced with anticipation and fear. The next few minutes would determine whether his risky plan would succeed or become a dangerous mistake. John gripped his flashlight tighter and waited, hoping he had made the right choice. The mother bear's behavior exceeded all of John's expectations. After investigating the scent trail, she returned to the shed entrance and made a soft grunting sound. The cubs appeared at the doorway, their small dark shapes visible against the snow. John watched in amazement as the mother bear guided them out, using her body to shield them from the bitter wind. The family followed the trail John had created, moving slowly but purposefully through the deep snow. The mother bear led the way, pausing frequently to ensure her cubs were following. The smaller of the two cubs struggled slightly, confirming John's earlier observation of a limp, but its siblings stayed close, offering support. From his position behind the truck, John could hardly believe what he was seeing. The bears moved with an almost human-like understanding of the situation, as if they knew they were being helped. The mother bear's careful movements suggested she was aware of his presence, but had somehow determined he wasn't a threat. As they approached the garage, the bears hesitated at the entrance. The mother bear stood on her hind legs briefly, her powerful form casting a shadow in the dim light. She sniffed the air carefully, her breath visible in the freezing temperature. The cubs huddled against her legs, shivering noticeably. John held his position, barely breathing. Everything hinged on what the mother bear decided in the next few moments. He had left the garage lights off, knowing that bright light might spook them, but had positioned his flashlight to provide just enough illumination for them to see inside. The mother bear lowered herself back to all fours and took a tentative step into the garage. She found the pieces of fish John had placed just inside the door and quickly consumed them. This seemed to convince her that the space was safe. She made another soft sound, and her cubs followed her inside. John watched as the bear family discovered the blankets he had arranged in the corner. The mother bear investigated the makeshift den thoroughly, circling it several times while her cubs waited. Finally, seeming satisfied, she settled onto the blankets, and her cubs immediately curled up against her. The transformation in their behavior was immediate. The warmth of the garage and the soft bedding seemed to comfort them immensely. The cubs, especially, relaxed visibly, their earlier distress fading as they snuggled into their mother's fur. Moving with extreme caution, John began to edge closer to the garage door. He needed to close it partially to keep the heat in, but he wanted to leave enough space so the bears wouldn't feel trapped. As he approached, the mother bear raised her head, watching him intently. In that moment, something remarkable happened. The mother bear's eyes met John's, and there was a deep intelligence in her gaze. She made no aggressive moves, no threatening sounds. Instead, She seemed to acknowledge his presence with a calm acceptance that left John speechless. Very slowly, John reached for the garage door. The mother bear watched his every move but remained relaxed, her cubs now dozing beside her. With trembling hands, he began to lower the door, stopping when it was about 2 feet from the ground. Enough space for the bears to leave if they chose to, but high enough to keep most of the warmth inside. The immediate danger had passed, but John knew his work wasn't done. He needed to monitor the situation throughout the night to ensure the bears remained safe and comfortable. Moving quietly, he retrieved a folding chair from nearby and set it up where he could watch the garage entrance. As the wind continued to howl outside, John sat in his chair, wrapped in his warmest coat. The temperature on his pocket thermometer showed -45 degrees Fahrenheit with the wind chill, making him even more grateful that he followed his instincts to help the bears. Inside the garage, the family had settled into a peaceful rest. The cubs were sleeping soundly, their small bodies rising and falling with each breath. The mother bear remained alert but relaxed, occasionally glancing at John with what he could swear was gratitude in her eyes. The rescue had succeeded beyond his wildest hopes, but the night was far from over. John adjusted his position in the chair, prepared for the long vigil ahead. He had already broken every rule in the Ranger's handbook, but watching the bear family sleep peacefully in the warmth of his garage, he knew he'd made the right decision. As the night deepened, John maintained his quiet vigil over the bear family. The wind outside had reached a fevered pitch, rattling the garage's metal walls, but inside, the bears remained peaceful. He had positioned himself where he could observe them without being intrusive, his old ranger instincts keeping him alert despite his growing fatigue. Every hour, John checked the thermometer. The temperature outside continued to plummet, reaching -50 degrees Fahrenheit with the wind chill, the coldest night he'd experienced in his 15 years at the cabin. The garage's heater hummed steadily, maintaining a bearable temperature that kept the space comfortable but not too warm for the winter-adapted bears. Around midnight, one of the cubs stirred and began to whimper softly. The mother bear immediately responded, shifting her position to allow the cub to nurse. John watched this tender interaction with amazement. In all his years as a ranger, he'd never been able to observe bears this closely or intimately. The mother's gentle care for her cubs reminded him of the universality of maternal love across species. The smaller cub, the one with the limp, occasionally moved in its sleep, and John could now see what appeared to be a minor injury on its back leg. Nothing serious, but enough to explain why the family might have abandoned their original den. They had likely been traveling in search of new shelter when the storm caught them off guard. Throughout the night, John documented everything in his ranger's notebook, his pencil moving quietly across the pages. He recorded the bears' behaviors, their sleeping patterns, and any movements or interactions. This unprecedented situation could provide valuable insights for wildlife research, though he knew many would disapprove of his intervention. Around 2 a.m., the mother bear raised her head suddenly, her ears perking up at a sound only she could hear. John tensed, ready to move if necessary, but she was merely responding to a branch breaking under the weight of ice outside. After a moment, she relaxed again, adjusting her position to better cover her cubs. John found himself talking softly to the bears, something he'd never done with wild animals before. He kept his voice low and soothing, sharing stories about his years in the Forest Service. The mother bear seemed to respond to his voice, occasionally turning her head to look at him with those intelligent eyes. "You're doing great, Mama," he whispered. "Just a few more hours until dawn." He knew better than to anthropomorphize wild animals, but in this extraordinary situation, it felt natural to acknowledge the trust she was showing him. As the night wore on, John fought to stay awake. He made brief trips to his cabin for coffee, moving as quietly as possible to avoid disturbing the bears. During one such trip, he called Mark again, updating him on the situation. His old friend was amazed but warned him to remain vigilant. Bears could be unpredictable, even when they seemed calm. Around 4 a.m., both cubs woke and began to play quietly with each other, their previous exhaustion apparently forgotten. Their mother watched them indulgently, but kept them from becoming too rambunctious. John smiled at their antics, reminded of his own children when they were young. The smaller cub appeared to be moving better, the rest in warmth having helped its injured leg. It still favored the leg slightly but managed to wrestle playfully with its sibling. The mother bear supervised their play carefully, occasionally nudging them back toward the blankets when they strayed too far. John checked his supplies of fresh water and picked up his binoculars for a closer look at the cubs. Their fur was beginning to dry properly in the garage's warmth, and their eyes were bright and alert. The mother bear's condition was also improving. Her breathing was no longer labored, and her movements were more fluid. As the night progressed, John reflected on how this extraordinary experience challenged everything he'd been taught about wildlife management. The traditional wisdom of never interfering with wild animals had its place, but sometimes, he realized, circumstances called for a different approach. The hours until dawn stretched ahead, but John remained committed to his watch. He had chosen to help these bears, and he would see it through to the end. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the mountain, but inside the garage, a remarkable tale of trust between species was unfolding. As the first hints of dawn crept into the sky, the storm finally began to lose its fury. John, still at his post in the garage, noticed the wind's howl diminishing to a whisper. The temperature outside had risen slightly, though it was still well below zero. Through the small gap under the garage door, he could see the snow had stopped falling. The bear family had settled into a comfortable routine during the night. The mother bear dozed lightly while keeping a watchful eye on her surroundings, and the cubs slept deeply, occasionally twitching in their dreams. The makeshift den of blankets had served them well, providing both warmth and comfort through the brutal night. Around 6 a.m., John observed a significant change in the mother bear's behavior. She became more alert, lifting her head frequently to sniff the air. Her cubs, sensing their mother's shift in mood, also began to stir. John recognized these signs. The bears were preparing to move on. The smaller cub stood up first, testing its injured leg. John was relieved to see it moving much better, putting more weight on the limb than it had the previous day. The rest and warmth had clearly helped its recovery. Its siblings soon followed, and both cubs began to explore the garage more boldly than they had during the night. Their mother watched them carefully, but made no move to stop their exploration. She seemed more relaxed now, as if she understood that the immediate danger had passed. When the cubs ventured near John's chair, she merely observed, showing a remarkable level of trust. John remained still as the bear family began their morning routine. The mother bear stretched her massive frame, her movements powerful yet graceful. She checked on her cubs, gently nudging them with her nose, perhaps assessing their condition after the long night. The rising sun painted the snow outside in shades of pink and gold. Through the garage's windows, John could see that the storm had transformed his property into a winter wonderland. Drifts of snow pressed against the buildings, and icicles hung like crystal daggers from every edge. Around 7 a.m., the mother bear stood up and made her way to the garage door. She investigated the opening John had left, testing it with her paw. Her cubs watched from the blankets, waiting for their mother's signal. John held his breath, knowing what was coming next. The mother bear turned back to her cubs and made a soft grunting sound. Immediately, they trotted to her side, their movements eager but controlled. The family stood together at the garage entrance, looking out at the fresh snow. The storm had passed, and with it, their need for human shelter. John remained in his chair, his heart heavy with both joy and sadness. He had grown attached to these remarkable animals during their brief time together, but he knew they needed to return to their wild home. The mother bear seemed to sense his emotions. She turned her head toward him one last time, meeting his eyes with that same intelligent gaze he'd noticed the night before. In that moment, something passed between them, an understanding that transcended the usual barriers between humans and wild animals. The mother bear held his gaze for several seconds, then deliberately dipped her head in what almost looked like a nod. Then, with surprising grace for such a large animal, she led her cubs out into the snow. The little family moved carefully through the deep drifts, their dark fur contrasting sharply with the pristine white landscape. The cubs bounded playfully behind their mother, their strength restored by their night of safe rest. John watched them make their way toward the tree line, following their tracks with his eyes until they disappeared into the forest. Only then did he allow himself to relax, the tension of the long night finally leaving his body. He was exhausted, but deeply satisfied. Standing up from his chair, John began to gather the blankets the bears had used. They were covered in fur and would need a thorough washing, but he didn't mind. These blankets would always remind him of the extraordinary night when he'd sheltered a bear family from the storm. As the morning sun continued to rise, John took one last look at the bears' tracks in the snow. They led away from his garage in a straight line, heading deeper into the wilderness. The story of their rescue would stay with him forever, a testament to the unexpected connections that could form between humans and wildlife when compassion overcame fear. In the days following the bear family's departure, John found himself constantly watching for signs of them in the surrounding forest. He maintained his regular routine but kept his binoculars close at hand, hoping to catch a glimpse of the bears he had helped through that terrible storm. A week after the rescue, while checking his property boundaries, John discovered fresh bear tracks in the snow. Following them carefully, he found evidence that the family had established a new den in a natural cave formation about a mile from his cabin. The tracks showed the smaller cub was walking normally now, its limp completely healed. As winter progressed, John occasionally spotted the bear family from a distance. The mother bear seemed to have chosen a territory that overlapped with his property, though she kept her cubs well away from human structures. Sometimes, in the early morning, he would see them foraging at the edge of the tree line, the cubs growing stronger and more confident with each passing week. Word of John's extraordinary night spread through the local ranger community. Mark Thompson, his old colleague, visited to document the incident for the Forestry Service records. While officially, the service couldn't condone his actions, privately, many rangers praised his judgment and courage. The story became something of a legend among wildlife officials in Montana. One morning in early spring, John sat on his porch with his morning coffee, watching the sunrise. Movement at the forest edge caught his attention. There stood the mother bear with her cubs, now noticeably larger than they had been during the storm. The family paused at the tree line, and the mother bear looked directly at his porch. Once again, their eyes met across the distance, that same understanding passing between them. The cubs, now powerful young bears themselves, played nearby as their mother watched. They showed no fear of the cabin but maintained a respectful distance, as if remembering the lessons of that winter night. John noticed how the once injured cub had grown into a strong young bear, its previous injury leaving no trace. Years passed, and John continued to live in his mountain cabin. The mother bear raised several more cubs in the area, and while she never again needed his help, she seemed to pass on a peculiar trait to her offspring. None of them showed the usual fear of his property that wild bears typically displayed. They would pass through his land peacefully, neither avoiding nor approaching his structures. Local wildlife photographers began to notice the unusual behavior of the bears in John's area. They captured images of bears moving calmly past his cabin, showing none of the stress or aggression that bears usually displayed near human dwellings. These photographs won several awards and were featured in nature magazines, though John never shared the full story of how this unique relationship began. On particularly cold winter nights, John would think back to that stormy evening when he chose to help rather than hide. The blankets the bears had used, though long since cleaned, remained stored in a special box in his garage. He kept them as a reminder of the night when the barrier between wild and tame had temporarily dissolved. In his final years as a resident of the mountain cabin, John documented his observations of the bear family and their descendants. His detailed notes and journals became valuable resources for wildlife researchers studying bear behavior and human-wildlife interactions. Though he never published his findings formally, his observations helped shape new understandings of bear intelligence and adaptability. As John grew older, he often told the story to his grandchildren when they visited. He taught them that sometimes the greatest acts of kindness required breaking with convention, and that nature, when approached with respect and compassion, could surprise you with its capacity for trust. The story of the bears and the storm became part of local folklore, passed down through generations of rangers and outdoor enthusiasts. While some doubted its truth, those who knew John and had seen the unique behavior of the bears in his area never questioned it. Even today, years after John finally moved to live with his daughter in Seattle, hikers and rangers in that area of Montana sometimes report seeing black bears that show an unusual calmness around humans. And on particularly cold winter nights, when the wind howls through the mountains, old-timers still tell the tale of the night when a retired ranger opened his door to a bear family, proving that compassion knows no bounds. The bears' descendants continue to roam those mountains, carrying in their DNA a remarkable legacy, the memory of a night when human kindness bridged the gap between wilderness and civilization, forever changing the relationship between one man and a family of bears.